car that they owned in joint tenancy. And her husband was involved in a very serious accident in which one person was killed and another person had millions of dollars worth of medical bills. And then she was sued for everything she had. And she was a very prolific real estate investor.
And let's just go back a little bit about that story, because I know, first of all, you talked about joint tenancy. So will you talk a little bit about, define that? What is joint tenancy and why, again, what made it turn out that way in such a negative way?
Well, joint tenancy is one of the most common forms of joint ownership, and it's very common among spouses and related people, siblings, etc. Joint tenancy basically means that you both have your name on a title of either real estate or a vehicle or some other title, and once again, it's a very, very common way of owning assets. But the problem is that when one joint tenant does something wrong, the other joint tenant could lose everything they own jointly with the wrongdoer, and possibly more. And so it's very important to consider, how do we own these potentially risky assets that could give rise to a lawsuit? How do we own those? Are they owned in a way that could involve you in a legal matter?
And I think the thing is we don't like to think about the bad things that something awful could happen. And I'm known for, yay! Oh, and I think I even forgot to say, hi, this is Jennifer Hammond. Yay! Because I got so busy with the whole, it's funny with going live on Facebook or YouTube or Clubhouse, you get the details sometimes get to be a little confusing. But I wanted to also say, when we never think about, like, if you slip and fall in a grocery store, or if you get into a car accident, or what other awful things can happen. So I hate to continue with negative stories, but would you share one more? I know you've got a bunch of them, of when someone did it wrong.
Well, sure. I mean, premises liability is a big issue. Those are the slip and fall cases. And the general rule, is that if you own a piece of property and you had a duty to maintain that property in a non-hazardous way, and someone is injured on that property, then you can be liable for anything. Here's an example. There were a couple of teenagers walking across a field, and they came upon an exposed live electrical wire, and they were badly burned as they touched it. Kids are going to be curious. Yeah. They touched it. They were badly, badly burned.
Kids love to touch everything.
Oh, yes, of course. And they ended up getting a $24 million judgment against the property owner for having that dangerous condition on his property. So, if we're a property owner,
repeat that. You said 24 million?
A $24 million judgment.
Ouch! That's a lot of money.
Oh, yes, it is. And once again, the reason is because we have a duty, typically as property owners, to protect against any hazards. This is why people with backyard swimming pools have to have a high fence, have it fenced in, because it's an attractive nuisance which could attract children and others, and create a harm. So
talk about that. That's another legal term. I was pre-law, so I know enough to know. I know enough to be dangerous. So will you talk about that? What does it mean? An attractive nuisance.
Well, once again, an attractive nuisance is a condition on a property that would allow someone to potentially injure themselves. It requires the negligence standard, which is knew or should have known. In other words, we need to think through, okay, what could possibly go wrong here? Who could possibly be injured? And then protect against it as a property owner.
And I think that I love the word attractive, because one of the things that I've seen from reading some of the cases is that in some ways, you have to almost have a foresight to know that it would be attractive to, whatever group of people, maybe to children or to, I don't know, somebody walking through your land, or just it's attractive in some way that maybe you thought about or maybe you haven't thought about before. So again, okay, so one more story of negative. So what did somebody do wrong with asset protection that they should have done better, or they should have talked to an attorney, or they should have gotten some kind of, because I want to start defining asset protection and dig in a little bit deeper on what are the ways to do that. But one more negative story, Bob.
Well, sure. And this is once again another kind of example of what we've been talking about. There was a case of a burglar on a roof trying to break into a building. This guy fell through a skylight, and was injured in the fall, and from his hospital bed sued the property owner for millions of dollars worth of his injuries. And so once again, you would think, well, this guy's a bad guy. I mean, he was, trying to rob the business. Well, none of that matters ultimately in the case. So once again, you have a duty to maintain the property in a non-hazardous way.
Well, and I think that that's such a good example too, because again, when we think, well, they were doing something wrong, they were breaking the law, and why couldn't they be rewarded? That's so frustrating. And that's part of the reason I wanted to kind of go through some of the negatives, in the fact that, asset protection, it's something that we all need to understand and really understand it. I want to say in a new unit at a time regularly, because the laws change. Would you agree?
Yes, they do. And, quite frankly, the laws have changed over a period of decades, so that in the past, in order to be sued, you actually had to do something really wrong, and wrong in the sense that we all understand. You punched somebody, you caused some accident. Now the laws have changed so that, frankly, you don't have to do anything wrong in the traditional sense in order to be sued. You could have signed a document the wrong way. You could, there's so many other ways. You could simply own an asset the wrong way, which entangles you in a lawsuit now. And so there are so many different examples. You can be liable for what your employees do wrong if you're an employer. You can be wrong for what a partner does wrong. I mean, you can be sued for what a partner does wrong. You can be sued for what your child does wrong if they're driving a car titled in your name. So there are so many different ways that you can be sued, having done absolutely nothing wrong yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's the scary part, is thinking that you don't want to live in fear. You want to actually just step forward with very sensible ways to protect yourself. So let's talk about that. Asset protection. What does that mean? How do you protect yourself?
Well, I like to think of it as, real estate, let's say, as a game, and if you're going to play a game, you suit up for the game. Think of football. You don't go out and, without protective gear and, get banged around and possibly injured. Instead, you put on the helmet and the protective gear. And the same thing is true if you're going to go play the real estate game. Don't be overly afraid. I mean, get into the game, but be protected as you get into the game. And that would be involving typically a limited liability company or corporation, or a limited partnership of some kind. Oftentimes we'll use a trust of various kinds. And these are simply protective measures that you would use. And then you go forward and don't be afraid. Go out and do deals and get into real estate and enjoy the practice. Yeah.
Enjoy the Monopoly game and make it a game, but also it's funny that Monopoly doesn't have that aspect to the game. But first and foremost, you should have your asset protection in place. So you should consult an attorney in your area to make sure you're talking about it. But also, I know that you work in many states, right? Not just in Texas, right?
Well, sure. We help people in many situations, and the key is that people are involved in different types of real estate. They will often come to us with properties in different states, and they need liability protection in those particular states. So we of course assist them, help them, and refer them if we're not able to in a particular case. Yep.
That's wonderful. I think it's important that, again, that you are reaching out and that you can help people in different places or refer them, which is important too, because sometimes it is local if it's a different state or whatnot. But you can do a lot of setting up their basics for them. So before I shift into some other details, I wanted to share a little bit, if you'll share a little bit about your journey into law.
Mm.
And from the, I want to say from the dark side, Bob moved from the dark side
Mm.
over to the light, to the good
Yes, well,
side.
I started many years ago as a trial lawyer and was in court, suing people, protect and defending people as well. And one particular case changed it all for me because we were defending a company and the company really had done something wrong here. Now, we're talking always about civil law. I never did criminal law. So no one ever goes to jail in the kinds of cases that I was dealing with. But the company had fired some people who they deemed to be too old, and that's age discrimination, which is actionable. In other words, these defendants, or rather these plaintiffs, were suing with a very valid claim. They had been fired because of their age, and they should have won the case. They had a great case, but because we were better lawyers, we actually won the case. And that's another aspect that we ought to talk about. So often, it's not a matter of who's right, who's wrong, who has the law on their side. It's who has the better lawyer. And sad to say, that's the way our legal system works. But you know, as the verdict was read, we had won the case. We left the courtroom, and the plaintiffs were there with their families. They were weeping and thinking, "How are we ever going to survive? We're going to lose our homes." They were never going to get hired again at the same wages. They were financially devastated, and that was wrong. And it struck me as being so wrong that I decided that I just wasn't going to do that anymore. And so I completely switched sides and took everything I had learned about suing people, and I use it now to protect people from lawsuits and lawyers like I maybe used to be. So,
You've gone from the dark side over to
yes,
the light.
yes.
And I think that that's one of the reasons I love for you to share that story, because it's so important to be able to understand that having mission-based anything, any of your businesses to be have a deep purpose of helping people, I think those are the people that we're going to make the most success in this world. Is really, that's my viewpoint in life, is that we want to help people as much as we possibly can. And hence the reason I wanted to make sure that we share asset protection in all those ways. So we have a couple more minutes. So we have more people that have joined us in the clubhouse room. So we will open up to questions around 8:30 today. So about half past the hour. But I wanted to, again, so Bob, I have more questions, of course. We could do this for hours and hours because I always have a gazillion questions. So for people who are also in real estate and they're looking at buying multifamilies or even going into a partnership with someone who is doing multifamily real estate investing, what are your suggestions for strategy there as far as owning an entity and then being able to, how do you share that partnership with when you have multiple people involved?
Well, there are some very important structures that someone should consider. And one is that you ought to have what we would call a holding company. And a holding company is simply a company that owns another company or part of another company. And so, to the extent that you're going to be owning a piece of an LLC or a limited partnership that is going to own the actual property. So, have I confused anybody yet? So in other words, let's think of it this way.
We need a whole chart. We need a whiteboard.
Yeah, yes, we do. But we have an entity that owns the multifamily property. But then the question is, who are the owners of that entity that owns the property? And it could be you as an individual, Jennifer Hammond, but it could also be Jennifer Hammond LLC that owns your interest in that property, and that would be your holding company. And there are a number of advantages to owning part of an equity interest in that way. Number of advantages, and so that is one thing that one should consider is how do you once again own your asset, and that is even an asset that needs to be protected as well. So. So that is one thing. If we're investing in smaller multifamily properties, you can do it as what's called a joint venture. Otherwise, if you're investing in a larger multifamily property, that would be a syndication. That requires a securities lawyer to make sure that you're complying with all state and federal securities laws. So it depends on, once again, the size of the property, the size of the investment, and whether that investment is being marketed to the public or is simply going to be a joint venture among friends who are all going to participate in that particular project.
And then I'm going to complicate it. So multifamily with multiple owners, say we have like a dozen owners, and then they're all in different states.
Well, once again, that could complicate things depending, once again, on the particular issues. But once again, it'll depend on, will they have any kind of an active role in that business, or will they be passive investors? That'll help to determine whether it's a security or a joint venture. And once again, those determinations are important to be made up front with an attorney, so you know exactly how to approach it.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I find that it gets more complicated as you cross state lines.
Oh yeah.
However, with real estate investing, even for myself, I like to cross state lines, because sometimes the deal that I'm looking for is definitely not in the jurisdiction in which I'm living. It's not where my domicile is, and so I want to make sure, if it's my home, I want to, my home state. I want to have whatever asset protection I can have for there, but again, crossing state lines, it's different in different states. And I think I would love for you to also talk a little bit to the fact that, like, there's certain states that are, I want to say, preferred versus other states when you're incorporating with an LLC, a C Corp, whatever it is that you decide. Like, for instance, the difference between, like, say, California versus Texas.
Well, there are some very big differences. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why it's really important to talk to someone who is knowledgeable in this area, because there are, frankly, about 30 states in which setting up an LLC is really not going to give you very much protection at all. And the reason is the states all vary in terms of how much protection they want to provide as a matter of public policy and state law. And as a result, there are some states that have said, we're going to be the best in terms of asset protection, and others that say, we don't care about protecting landlords, we would rather protect the tenants. And so we need to know, are we in a landlord-friendly state, or are we in a state with strong state laws that are going to protect you in as many instances as possible, or are we in a state that is going to favor the other party, your tenants, as opposed to you, and not give you much protection at all?
And I think that that's really critical in, like in Washington, D.C., it's definitely let the landlord beware. I always go back to that caveat emptor, that Latin phrase of let the buyer beware. And in Washington, D.C., it's definitely let the landlord beware, because we have so many protections for the tenant, to the point where we also have a thing called TOPA, T-O-P-A, Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act. And what that has done is it's really taken away and I know there's been a lot of lawsuits about this. It's take away a right that a lot of property owners find is a basic right, and that's the basic right to sell the property to the person you want, because the tenant has the right to buy first opportunity. They can match an offer, they can buy it out from underneath another buyer. It's really complicated. Tenants and sellers or landlords in our area, and I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, so we're crossing state lines all the time: Virginia, D.C., Maryland. But I also
very common in your area. Yeah.
So it's very common to understand that each law is I want to say each state is different in the way that they look at asset protection, especially for real estate, and how we can again protect our rental properties, or if you decide to go into a partnership, which again is very common because a lot of times we're looking at private money. And so you raise the money from a private source, from an individual, from somebody other than a bank or a hard money. And so now we need to figure out, how do we protect each person's interest in that thing? And so what advice do you have for someone who is just thinking about doing a partnership, and maybe it's just going to be two people? One person's going to be the money and the other person's going to really be the sweat equity, is going to manage the whole project and do it.
Yeah, it's very common to partner with people in real estate. If we're in a very common situation that you just described, one's the sweat equity partner, one is the money partner. And the important thing to realize is that you don't want to do a handshake deal. That puts you into what's called a general partnership, in which you can end up going broke for what your partner has done wrong, because in a partnership, each partner has the ability to bind the partnership. And so what is a stronger, more safer way to do business is to form an entity in which the two of you are either shareholders of a corporation or owners of the LLC. And that precludes your being considered as a partnership, a general partnership, I should say, which dramatically limits your liability.
Very good. So, and again, that's always state specific. So find out what is important. And I know you also are very happy to help people. If anyone is interested in finding out more, they can contact you. I know you were telling me best email is info, info at assetdefenseteam.com. And you're happy to answer questions for anybody.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm about to open the floor here to answer other questions, but I think that it's one that, again, people are constantly, the laws are changing, and then they go, oh, it'll never happen to me, which is again one of the reasons I started with all the scary stories, I'm going to call it, in the beginning of the hour of, oh my gosh, I can't believe someone, again, someone who was a thief all of a sudden gets hurt on your property and then sues you for millions of dollars. It seems so wrong on our core morally to have somebody do that kind of stuff. So how you protect yourself is really, really important. So again, I'm definitely, we'll do other shows and we want to dig deeper into some of the tax issues. But before we do that, I wanted to open it to our speakers. John Lee, I wanted to see, I hope you're there and you're listening. Do you have any questions for our attorney, Bob, to talk about asset protection? John Lee is also a real estate investor, and he has, over the years, he started with mortgages, and then he started actually getting property after property. So he actually works with a lot of land, which is different than others. So John's not picking up. So I'm assuming that John's in a listen only mode. Oh, there you are, John. Oh, he's in a listen only mode. Hey, John.
Hi, good morning, Jennifer. Thank you. Yeah, we had a bad connection here. I do have one quick question, and thank you, Bob, for all the great information. My question would be, I've got a small property that we're getting ready to fix right now, and I met with a guy who is he's actually somebody that owes me some money buying another property, and he's kind of not really a handyman, but he does drywall and stuff. Should I just be concerned about liability with him working on the property? It's a short-term project, or should I just go ahead and continue to run everything through my LLC like I've always done, or should I have some extra concern there, Bob?
Yeah, good question, John. I would have caution and make sure that anybody doing work on your property is, first of all, bonded, insured. And people often ask, are you insured? Yeah. and they don't go further than that. Ask to see documentation. Make sure they're really bonded and
I was
insured.
going to say, I actually learned that the hard way as well. People will say, "Oh yeah, I've got the insurance," and I had some people that were looking at doing a roof job, and I was like, roofs can people can fall off of roofs. And all of a sudden, when I started to, after they said, "Yeah, we're insured," I went ahead and I said, I actually would really like to see that documentation. Could you just email it over? And that's when they went, "Well, we're actually not in my state." And they, because I have DC, Virginia, and Maryland, they are actually in other states, but not mine, which happens a lot with Washington, DC area, because Virginia and DC are so close to each other, and Maryland. So we often had that. So that is, I think, a key thing is to one. So I'm sorry, I jumped in there before. I want you to finish answering that question. So number one, you should ask them to see their documentation, no matter how long you've known them or whatever. You can use the excuse that my wife said I have to do this, or you could say my lawyer said,
my banker says I have to.
My banker said I have to get a copy of it. Do you mind just sending it over? And people who have it don't mind at all. They literally, it's boom, it's super fast. They just email it to you and it's done. I learned that, as I said, the hard way from my roof. And it was interesting because, of course, there was very different prices for people who were insured versus people who are not. And I was like, but they have to, they're paying for their insurance. So it's a business cost for them. So I understand it. Anyway, I totally interrupted you. So then again, what other things that should John be doing that would help protect him even more?
Well, and John, you mentioned, should I run it through my LLC like I usually do? And the short answer is yes. And think about what LLC means. It stands for Limited Liability Company. It limits your liability. So anytime you can limit your liability, use an entity that'll do that by all means. So that's a quick and dirty answer. I'm sure we could talk about that in much more detail, but yes.
Absolutely. Okay, good. And now I was going to go to David. I don't know if you're in listen only mode. Would you like to ask a question too? Welcome.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Yeah, it's really awesome to be here with Bob. He's so smart, and I could ask questions for that whole remaining half hour. But I met Bob at the Heroes Coaches Conference down in Key West, Florida.
What? Key West? That's where I'm from.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Where things broke free, and they were able to go down there, and we could have a conference in a safe manner. It was great. I met Bob, and he's so smart. This is an amazing time to have, and we're not even having to pay anything right now. So everybody ought to ask a question for free. This is cool. But Bob, I'm really interested just in your perspective of the mixture of how you might combine land trust with asset protection and kind of the difference, between those two. And I don't want to make it an open-ended question, but just, I'm always amazed at, the concept of LLCs and asset protection, and then also with, estate planning type and protection from like land trust. So just a few words on, your thought about mixing those and stuff.
We commonly do that. Land trusts are a very good tool for a number of reasons. They provide anonymity. They shield you from having to be on the title. So in other words, the trust is on the title to the property. Your name doesn't have to appear on the title. And that gives you a lot of advantages in the sense that who's more likely to be sued? Someone who owns 25 properties or someone who owns no properties whatsoever? Lawyers work on a contingency fee basis when they're suing. And if they think you have no assets, they do some quick math and think 50% of zero is zero. So why would they bother to sue if they can't get anything from you? So a land trust is valuable in the sense that it makes it appear that you own fewer or no assets than you really do. It gives you that anonymity. The land trust in and of itself does not provide liability protection the way a limited liability company does. So in a trust, we have both a trustee and a beneficiary, and we use LLCs for both the trustee and the beneficiary because, again, that provides anonymity and very, very good liability protection. One of the other aspects is that you mentioned estate planning. because a land trust is a living trust, it would avoid probate. So in other words, what a lot of real estate investors don't realize is that when they own real estate in various states, they may have to go through probate in every one of those states when they pass away, which is a nightmare for those you leave behind. When we do use land trusts in connection with limited liability companies, then you're not going to go through probate. The land trust itself avoids probate. So those are only a couple of the advantages of using land trusts. And we do use land trusts in combination with limited liability companies as well. Yeah. Good question.
I think that was awesome. And I'm going to ask you, so first of all, I'm going to start bringing some people up who've raised their hands. So anyone who's in the audience right now, if you want to raise your hand, I'm going to start bringing you guys up and you can ask questions. So first of all, Shelly, she is, there you go. Hi, Shelly. Do you have a question for Bob?
Oh, yes, I do. Thank you for taking my question. Just real quick. So can you use asset protection for like anything that's not involved with real estate, like your own personal residence or your own personal assets?
By all means, that's very, very commonly done as well. Anyone can have any kind of a business or just have assets and have a need to protect them from perceived liability. By all means, we can use any number of tools that would give you reduced or limited liability. Yes, good question.
Okay, and how would someone go about doing that? Like, say if you're purchasing, whatever it is that you're doing or you want to protect, how would you go about doing that?
Well, we'd want to analyze the vulnerabilities that you might have where you could be liable, and then determine what would best foreclose those kinds of liabilities and or protect you from them. So that would involve a consultation with a knowledgeable attorney, and you'd want to be able to specify what you perceive to be your liabilities and what assets you want to protect.
And that let me jump in real quick. I'm sorry. So Shelly, one of the things that is really important is also, and I don't know if you're up for sharing what specifically, like we were just talking about a rental property, or we're talking about different specific things. So Bob, you also will give people a free consultation. I mean, we've got another 25 minutes, I think, in here. Or no, 20 minutes. We got about 20 more minutes in here. And I'm obviously anybody who wants to, I see some, raise your hand and ask questions, but you also will talk to people for free. They can just call your office and make an appointment, right?
Yes, we can have a short 15-minute quick consultation and get an idea of if there's some way that we can point you in the right direction. And if so, then more than happy to help.
Yeah, so feel free, again, info@assetdefenseteam.com, info@assetdefenseteam.com. And so Shelly, do you have a specific business that you're thinking about, or a specific thing that you're trying to protect?
No, not a specific business or anything, but like I was thinking like maybe like your personal residence or things like that.
So a trust, maybe? What would you suggest, Bob?
Well, once again, we want to examine in a little more detail that, but a trust could be a possibility. There are different kinds of trusts that are both revocable and irrevocable that we might consider using. There could possibly be single member LLCs. There could be possibly other types, maybe a limited partnership of depending upon any number of factors. If the personal residence is owned with someone else, there could be a form of joint ownership that we could use. Tenancy by the entireties is often used in various states among husbands and wives. So it all depends upon what the particular situation is, and that's why we have the consultation to determine those facts.
Okay, good. We have some other questions. I want to make sure we don't run out of time. So we have Eddie. Eddie, do you want to share, or do you have a question that you have for Bob?
Yes, good morning. I'll probably definitely need to do a consultation with Bob, and it'll probably go a little bit more than 15 minutes. But the general question, Bob,
talked about a couple things for asset protection. All of my properties are presently in an LLC. We have general liability against on all of our properties, and we also placed an umbrella insurance policy over all of the properties. We had a child die at one of our properties. Fortunately, we were not found liable, but when that happened, it scared the heck out of me because I could have lost everything, with a lawsuit. So in addition to what I presently have in place, the general liability on the properties and the umbrella, what other things could I do? Because I also have to think about the financing. If I put things in land trust, does that affect the present financing that I have in place because it changes possibly the ownership? That's my question.
Yeah, so sorry to hear about that tragic happening on your property. It's awful. But it is something that illustrates what can happen, and life happens, and tragic accidents do occur. We would really need to look at the specifics, what states, what properties, how they're currently protected, to determine if there is a different structure that we could use. That doesn't necessarily mean undo everything that you've already done. It simply often means to maybe add an entity here, have these entities owned by another entity perhaps, and create different layers of liability protection. Just as you've done on the insurance side, you've done well. You've insured the properties, and yet you have an umbrella policy. Those are different layers of insurance. And we can do the same thing in terms of layering with liability protection, so that if one barrier doesn't hold, at least there are other barriers that they would have to get through in order to get at your assets. So that would involve really a more in-depth consultation. And looking forward to having that with you. Be happy to.
If you could touch on one more thing, I've often heard the term piercing the corporate veil. What
Correct.
type of things would allow? Because on another side, I own a construction company, and all of my clients are, if they're not Fortune 500, well, Pilot Travel Centers, AutoZone. I mean, we do work for pretty large interest. Once again, thankfully, never had any issues, but I own a lot of assets on both sides of the table, if that makes sense. What things would, I guess, allow someone to pierce the corporate veil in a legal type situation? If you could just give one example of that.
Sure.
Please.
And I'm glad you raised that, because it's important not only to have the right kind of entity set up the right way, but then to operate the entity in a way that will maintain the limited liability protection. And so typically it is called an alter ego doctrine that allows someone to pierce the corporate veil. And piercing the corporate veil to anyone else simply means that they cut through the LLC or corporation or whatever it is and get at your personal assets. The whole idea of the limited liability is to limit your liability to the assets within that particular entity. So, and not be able to have your personal assets at risk. When they pierce the corporate veil, your personal assets do become at risk. And that will typically happen by commingling assets. We commingle business and personal assets. We might pay a personal credit card bill out of a business bank account. There are many different factors that courts look at, and there's no one factor that's determinative. They weigh the different factors and determine, was this entity operated in such a way as to maintain the separateness between the business and you personally.
Yeah, and I think that's really important.
Okay.
Number one, you talk about piercing the corporate veil is something that people don't think about. Is number one, they just either don't put up any kind of asset protection, or number two, they don't understand the layering, as you said before, and the fact that people can pierce the corporate veil. So Eddie, that was awesome. Did you have one more thing, Eddie?
No, could you give me that email address again to reach Bob? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's info at assetdefenseteam.com. assetdefenseteam.com. So assetdefenseteam.com, info@assetdefenseteam.com. And yeah, he has a great team there as well to help. And I highly recommend that you go ahead and reach out to him. Yay!
All right. Bob, I live in McKinney, Texas, so I'm in the DFW area. All of my real estate is in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. So I only invest there, but I'll reach out to you. So we're in the same city.
All right. Well, great, Eddie.
Yeah, I look forward to it. That's awesome. Thanks, Eddie. And then I wanted to go ahead before, again, we ran out of time. We have Cece. Cece, did you want to go ahead and ask a question for Bob?
Yes, I do. Hi, Jennifer.
Hello.
Thank you for doing this. And thank you for.
You're welcome. Go right ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Bob, for doing this. Yes, I do have a question. If you consider, oftentimes asset protection and tax planning goes hand in hand. And so with regards to partnership, assuming you want to start like a business with another partner, and you also want to, you are looking at tax protection and looking at the entities that work, and as well as asset protection and anonymity, what would be the best thing to do about that instead of just having the entity and maybe have an agent or something like that? Is there an alternative to that?
Well, what I often do is consult with your tax professional when we're in the process of setting up a structure or even designing a structure. We often will want to talk with your accountant, your CPA or enrolled agent, whoever's doing your taxes, and make sure that we're all on board, because they may have some specific information that I may not have, because they're working on a different side of things. They're working on the specific tax side, and so we do this as a team. In other words, we want to make sure that anything we do on the asset protection side is going to work hand in glove with the tax strategies that you may have with your tax professional going forward. And if we don't have tax strategies, we need to get some. So we'll be wanting to introduce that to your tax professional as well.
Okay, so what are the aspects of the partnership? So assuming the entity has been created and is tax optimized, now with respect to asset protection and anonymity in a partnership, how do you think of, like, how would be the best way to go about that?
Well, I'm not 100% sure of your question. If we've gotten an optimal tax strategy and now we have an entity with somebody else, I assume, is that correct, Cece?
Yes, with somebody else, yes. But at the same time, you want the anonymity so that people don't just look you up and then go to sue just because.
The anonymity.
Oh, anonymity.
So, yeah. She wants to make sure that nobody can find out that they're partners.
I see. Well, that would come into play when we structure the entity in the first place. Well, we would have to design the entity in such a way, determining what information is revealed in that particular state when we file. Some states require a lot of disclosure, other states do not. And so we would, first of all, want to set up the entity in a state where you do not have to disclose much information. And if we have to file in a state where a lot of disclosure is required, then we can use various trusts to provide anonymity for you so that information remains anonymous and private.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You bet. Mm-hmm.
You're welcome. And I want to say to the audience, we have a couple more minutes here. If you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. That's that what is it? The third button over. If you're a newbie and you don't know where the buttons are, there's the microphone, the plus, and then there's of course the raise your hand button. And so I'm going to go ahead and I don't see any more raised hands. I always try to make a thing. I was trying to, John a lot of times also helps with moderating in here. Sometimes I forget to make sure that we get him. So I wanted to go back to David. I know David said that he also might have another question. Do you want to have one more question with Bob before we're at the top of the hour?
Yes, I guess I'm kind of curious about the out-of-state concept with properties. And it might be more of a tax question too. So that's really important to know what you said about, say you get a rental house in Florida instead of Texas or some other state like that, then to evict that tenant, if something goes wrong, you have to have someone represent you, and you have to have legal entity thing in it. But I think, isn't there ways to I guess your thoughts, Bob, on whether you create the LLC in the state where the property's at, or I've read about, you can like register your LLC in that state. Any difference between the two on maybe what some of your thoughts are on whether you form a completely new LLC for the state or try to do some way of registering it in that state?
Well, you're correct in the sense that you can have an entity formed in a particular state. So let's say you own property in Florida, and you don't live in Florida necessarily. Or let's say you live in, I'm going to say Texas. You own property in Florida, very common. And now the question is, you have a Texas LLC. Should you form a brand new LLC in Florida? Or should you just register your Texas LLC as a foreign entity qualified to do business in Florida? Those are both options. That presents a couple of issues that we would have to determine. And one is, is this just one property in Florida, or are we going to be creating a rental portfolio in Florida? If that's the case, if the latter is the case, then probably we would set up a Florida LLC because it would provide better liability protection for the grouping, and it would make sense. In other words, it's worth setting up the LLC in Florida. For one property, probably not, and then we would simply register that Texas LLC in Florida as a foreign entity. But it's important to realize that we do have to have that registration in the state, one way or the other, and the reason is, if you're renting to somebody, a citizen of Florida, you're doing business in Florida. And as a result, the state of Florida has an interest in making sure that citizen that renter is protected under Florida law, et cetera, that you are going to be complying with Florida law and procedures, that the state of Florida, at least knows who you are and that you're operating in the state, and that they have possibly a tax issue with you. In other words, if you're deriving income from that state, possibly they may want to tax you in that state on those earnings. So there are all kinds of state interests that arise and that would require you to want to be qualified to do business in that particular state.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand. Like I said, in the Washington, D.C. area, we're crossing state lines all the time.
All the time.
I'm constantly, even with my real estate licenses, I'm constantly remembering, okay, this is what is allowed in this state. This is not allowed in this state. And oh my goodness, it is very different, the personalities of each one of those states and how they approach not only real estate, but also liability, asset protection. And of course, we're right next door, as you know, to Delaware. And Delaware has so many, at least from my viewpoint, it seems like they have so many benefits that some of the other states don't have. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, and Delaware's long been viewed as a corporate headquarters, especially for publicly traded companies. Other states have kind of emerged for privately held companies as the place to go. But yes, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really important, again, just to kind of have that overview of, and this is what I would say to you is if anybody wanted to reach out, feel free, you can reach out to Bob. It's not a high pressure sales, but he's definitely, he's always interested in helping. And if you heard his story, his personal story, his mission in life is to help people and to be on the good side of helping the good guys. And quite frankly, I want to say those of us who are successful, but not necessarily those of us who are the massive corporations who, as in his story, illustrated that sometimes in the court system, when you go to court, not always does the good guy win. It's the one who has the better lawyer who wins. And I want to say the better asset protection. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to make sure we did this, to just highlight, if you haven't looked at your asset protection strategies. So first of all, I know that one thing that a lot of times people ask is, I know probably the most dangerous thing is what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so even for anyone who's interested in setting their goals, what would you suggest to somebody who is thinking about getting into rental properties as far as just setting up their goals and the basic liability structure that they should be looking for?
Well, if someone's thinking about getting into rental properties, get a guide, get a coach, get a mentor who can show you what mistakes to avoid, where the landmines are, so to speak, and that's on the offense side, so you don't make mistakes as you're trying to make money. But then on the defense side, because every game has an offense and a defense. On the defense side, have once again a guide, a mentor, so to speak. That would typically be an attorney who specializes in asset protection, who's aware of these issues, and can make sure that you have the armor on, so to speak, before you go into battle, and make sure that as you do business, that you have limited liability. Once again, that you're taking advantage of all the tax benefits that are out there, and that you do business in the most profitable and efficient way.
Well, that's beautiful. As I always end every room, I always want to end it with our yay. So I'm going to ask everyone who's in Clubhouse, John Lee, David, everyone, even Eddie, you're up on stage still. If you would come off your mics and let's say yay, and a big thank you, of course, to Bob. Thank you for being here. But Bob, also I ask if you would lift your voice and say yay as we go off the air. And thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, 3, 2, 1.